Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar with Corey VanStratt. And the presentation will be on Ducks Unlimited and the power of partnerships. All right, so thank you again for attending today's webinar as a part of Chagrin River Watershed Partners winter webinar series for the 2023 to 2024 season. My name is Chris. I'm an AmeriCorps service member serving as the watershed steward at Chagrin River Watershed Partners. This is our 10th and last webinar as a part of our series, where CRWP partners with environmental professionals to deliver educational presentations to other interested professionals and members of the public. Our next speaker series will begin in December of this year, and we will start promoting new webinars sometime in the fall. If you have any suggestions for what topics we should cover or how we can make this series better, please submit your suggestions in our survey, which I'll include in my follow-up email. If you have any questions, feel free to type any as we go in the chat box on your screen, and we can cover them at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. Today's presentation is being recorded and will eventually be uploaded to our YouTube page. In my follow-up email, I'll include a link to this recording so you can review it at any time. For today's webinar, Corey VanStratt from Ducks Unlimited will present on their involvement in wetland protection and restoration projects in Northern Ohio. Mr. VanStratt will present on DU's involvement in protection projects in Northeast Ohio through the American Wetlands Conservation Act. Mr. VanStratt will also present on DU's involvement in restoration projects in the Western Lake Erie Basin and the crucial partnerships that made this work possible. More broadly, Mr. VanStratt will speak about the importance of addressing conservation on both private and public lands to adequately address the environmental issues we face. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corey VanStratt. And Corey, welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. Thank you all for joining. Hello, my name is Corey VanStratt, Regional Biologist with Ducks Unlimited. Today I'll be presenting on the power of partnerships in conservation and the necessity of these partnerships to achieve conservation goals and objectives, both in Ohio and beyond. Many thanks to CRWP for hosting this webinar series and for asking me to speak on this topic today. Just as a brief note, the Conservation for a Continent is a new historic $3 billion comprehensive campaign between Ducks Unlimited Inc., Ducks Unlimited Canada, Ducks Unlimited Mexico, and Wetlands American Trust, which is the DU accredited land trust, designed to allow DU to expand on the 18 million acres that we've already conserved through partnerships. We work locally to achieve state and initiative objectives, but we also work in partnership with our continental brethren to achieve continental scale conservation goals. As we know, waterfowl and migratory birds do not recognize local, state, or international boundaries, meaning we as conservationists must think on this larger scale as well, requiring partnerships to ensure ample habitat is conserved at all extents of the range and throughout the annual cycle. So again, I'm Corey, and I began with Ducks Unlimited in November 2022. I actually began as a Great Lakes Initiative biologist sharing time in Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, but was quickly transitioned to working just in Ohio due to the great amount of conservation opportunity in the state. This is a testament to the great partnerships that have been forged here. Russ Terry is the Ohio Senior Regional Biologist, so there are currently 2 full-time DU biologists dedicated to Ohio. So a quick overview of the presentation. First, I'll briefly touch on the DU vision and mission. I'll describe the expanding conservation program in Ohio, and then elaborate on the North American Wetlands Conservation Act and how we've used those grants and partners to protect wetlands in Northeast Ohio. From there, we'll go on a tour of restoration projects in the Western Lake Erie Basin and examine how partnerships have made these projects possible. And finally, I'll detail some upcoming projects and where we're headed next. So just in case some of you aren't aware, that familiar with Ducks Unlimited, a brief history. DU got its start in 1937 during the Dust Bowl, when North America's drought-plagued waterfowl populations had plunged to unprecedented lows. Determined not to sit idly by as the continent's waterfowl dwindled beyond recovery, a small group of sportsmen joined together to form DU with a mission of habitat conservation. Due to decades of abiding by the single mission, DU is now the world's largest and most effective private waterfowl and wetlands conservation organization, working through a series of partnerships with other non-governmental organizations, private individuals, landowners, local, state, and federal agencies, and scientific communities that allow us to deliver on this mission. DU is a grassroots, volunteer-based organization. More than 4,000 grassroots fundraising events are held annually, providing grassroots funding that conservation staff can then use as private funds to leverage public funding. So our vision, wetlands sufficient to fill the skies with waterfowl today, tomorrow, and forever. And our mission, conserve, restore, and manage wetlands and associated habitats for North America's waterfowl. These habitats also benefit other wildlife and people. Our mission drives our daily actions. Historically, DU wetland conservation projects were conducted on waterfowl breeding areas in the Canadian prairies, and funds raised in the US were directed to these efforts. In the 1980s, however, a focus was also aimed toward the prairie pothole region in the US and then to other regions of the US, including the Great Lakes region. The North American Waterfowl Management Plan, or NAWAMP, was established in 1986, providing a directive for continental scale conservation, and the North American Waterfowl Conservation Act, or NACA, followed in 1989 in support of NAWAMP to provide grants to protect and manage wetland habitats for migratory birds and other wetland wildlife in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. DU really started implementing projects in Ohio in the 90s, often utilizing NACA, with nearly 131,000 acres conserved since that time, and a total investment in the state of just over $53 million. 2023 was another record year for DU in Ohio. We worked with our great conservation partners to conserve almost 1,200 acres of wetlands and invested $5.5 million to get this work done. This marks the 8th consecutive year DU has set a new high water mark for financial investment in conservation here in Ohio. And looking at the 2023 investment compared to total investment since the 90s, about 10% of total investment occurred in 2023. So here, this graph displays the growth of DU's conservation footprint here in Ohio by fiscal year. The blue bars represent our financial investment into conservation in the state over time. Way back in 2000, we invested just $237,000 in Ohio. In 2010, it was $420,000. In 2012, we were at $1.5 million. 2021 was $2.9 million. 2022 and 23 were $4.5 and $4.6 million respectively. And in our current fiscal year 24, which ends on June 30th, we're on pace to invest $6.8 million on conservation here in Ohio, which would set another record for DU and is largely due to opportunities with our partners within the state. Just as a note, we're also growing our staff capacity in Ohio. We hired Colleen Gleason as a private lands biologist to help grow and deliver wetland restoration on private land in the Western Lake Erie Basin states of Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. This is a shared position between Ducks Unlimited and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Partners for Fish and Wildlife. We've added 3 professional engineers for Ohio and Michigan, and we're now working with ODOW, the Division of Wildlife, and Ohio NRCS to hire another shared position, this one to help design and implement wetland restoration on private land through CREP, the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. Finally, as we expand our reach within the Great Lakes, we have another biologist that began a new position in our Working Lands Division to work with agricultural producers in Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana to enroll their farms in the cover crop programs aimed at improving soil health, wildlife habitat, and water quality. One brief moment. So let's focus now on protection projects in Northeast Ohio and how partnerships have made this a reality. As previously mentioned, DU has utilized NACA since their inception, and this remains true to this day, especially for protection projects in Northeast Ohio. Again, NACA was initiated in 1989 to provide federal cost share funding in support of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. It's administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Division of Bird Habitat Conservation, and projects must involve long-term protection, restoration, and/or enhancement of wetlands and associated upland habitats for the benefit of all wetland-associated migratory birds. 2 programs are available: a standard program with 2 funding cycles per year and a $3 million cap, and a small NACA program with 1 funding cycle per year and a $250,000 cap. These are funded by annual appropriations from Congress, Migratory Bird Treaty Act funds, Pittman-Robertson interests, and boat motor fuel taxes through the Sport Fish Restoration Act. Traditionally, the standard and small NAWCA programs were capped at $1 million and $100,000 respectively, but just last year, the caps were raised, increasing the opportunity for even more funding through NAWCA. So what is the process for coordinating a NAWCA proposal? We submitted a proposal last July for Northeast Ohio entitled Lake Erie Coastal Wetlands Phase 4. So I'll briefly describe the process. Essentially, within a proposal, there are match tracks, match and grant funded tracks, and some grant only funded tracks. A proposal with at least 2-to-1 grant to match ratio scores best. So for a standard $3 million NAWCA grant, $6 million in match brought to the table by partners is essential. For this particular Phase 4 proposal, we were generously hosted by Western Reserve Land Conservancy at their office back in April 2023. Prior to that meeting, we had asked about a dozen partner groups to consider potential match properties in addition to acquisitions or restorations that they needed partially or completely funded by the grant. Through this meeting, we discussed the potential properties, got them all tallied up in a spreadsheet, and in a day, with a bit of horse trading, managed to whittle it down to a pretty good list where we had $3 million in grant funds accounted for and at least $6 million in match. I took this back to the office and fine-tuned the list and then worked closely with these dozen partners to coordinate track descriptions, compile detailed funding tables, gather title work, put together maps of the properties, and get all the I's dotted and T's crossed on the proposal and associated paperwork. It was then submitted early July of last year and took every part of the 3-month period to complete. Now, even if a proposal is funded, this proposal building period is not a grant covered cost and is just an expense that we build into our budget and pay for here at DU. Proposals are then scored and initial recommendations are provided by the North American Wetlands Conservation Council in December. Funding should then be available this upcoming July. All in all, it is a year process from submission to learning if your proposal was recommended to the grant agreement. So now a few key points about scoring. Oops, sorry about that. Particularly NAWCA promotes partnerships. So there are several categories that are scored through technical assessment questions. If a proposal has 4 plus 10% match partners, so $300,000 or greater for a $3 million proposal, it receives more points in that category. If a proposal has 4 plus partner categories, meaning NGOs, local governments, state agencies, federal agencies, private landowners, it scores higher in that category. A proposal receives more points if it brings on at least one new NAWCA partner. And this year we were able to bring on West Creek Conservancy, and we forged a new partnership there. So not only are partnerships necessary to execute the work, but they are rewarded in the proposal process itself. So finally, good proposals should conserve decreasing wetland types like emergent and forested wetlands. Having a focus in the coastal zone is beneficial, and the overall proposal should be landscape-based and diverse, allow public access on a majority of the acreage, and have a focus on wetland-associated birds, including federally threatened and endangered species and Ohio species of greatest conservation need. So since 2009, we have completed 4 NAWCA grants in Northeast Ohio, with the 5th proposal, Lake Erie Coastal Wetlands Phase 3, which had a grant agreement beginning in 2021, closing in about a week and a half. Through these grants, we've collectively with partners been able to conserve about 11,188 acres, with about 90% of these being protection acres through either fee purchase, acquisitions, or conservation easements. Additionally, we also direct some of the funds to another partner, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program, to complete restoration projects on private lands in the project area. Lake Erie Coastal Wetlands Phase 2 sent $100,000, Phase 3 sent $50,000, and Phase 4 will send $105,000 to PFW for these private lands restoration projects. The number of properties protected through a proposal is dependent on several factors and varies between proposal, but as an example, Phase 3 will protect 21 different properties, will restore 3 different wetlands, and will enhance another property. With all acquisition properties, a layer of protection is recorded through a notice of grant requirements, or NOGR, which requires adherence to the NAWCA grant requirements, which includes the obligation to ensure the long-term conservation of the property. So here's a look at where we've worked with our partners through the 5 NAWCA grants. The Grand River Wetlands project covered the 4-county area of Ashtabula, Trumbull, Geauga, and Lake counties. The Northeastern Ohio Wetlands project expanded this to a 5-county area, including Portage County. And Lake Erie Coastal Wetlands expanded this to include a 9-county area, including Summit, Medina, Lorain, and Cuyahoga counties. Finally, phases 2 through 4 added Erie County to the mix. Through the 5 Northeast Ohio grants, we've been able to protect 16, 21, 9, 15, and 21 properties respectively. The dotted black line that you see is the Lake Erie Watershed Coastal Zone boundary, or the watershed, and you'll notice that most properties are within this boundary. Restorations of the bright blue dots mainly occurred through PFW projects on private lands using these NAWCA funds obligated to them for this purpose. You also notice that a large chunk of these partnership projects have occurred in Ashtabula and Trumbull counties. From the early description of the proposal process, we know that properties are already identified at the time of proposal, but then due diligence such as appraisals, appraisal reviews, and boundary surveys often occur during the grant period, which the partner typically lines up, but it's something DU can line up as well. Ducks Unlimited will then wire grant funds to a closing or reimburse the partner with grant funds depending on the situation and preference. So who are the NAWCA partners in Northeast Ohio? A lot of different groups have been involved, but besides DU, 11 dedicated partners were involved in the Phase 3 grant, including Ashtabula County Metro Parks, Ashtabula County Wildlife Conservation League, Cleveland Metro Parks, Cleveland Museum of Natural History, the Minchell Children's Trust, National Wild Turkey Federation, Natural Areas Land Conservancy, Ohio Division of Wildlife, Portage Park District, Western Reserve Land Conservancy, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So another rewarding aspect of this partnership is that given we're all on the 5th NAWCA grant in Northeast Ohio, we've been able to consistently work with groups like Western Reserve and Cleveland Museum of Natural History and several of the park districts to use these grants to continue to expand preserves and blocks of protected land, building protected habitat corridors for migratory birds. This past Monday, Western Reserve Land Conservancy closed on the final tract of Lake Erie Coastal Wetlands Phase 3, which is a conservation easement at the Kingsville Swamp in Ashtabula County, which protects 83.5 acres, much of which is a pristine perched peat wetland. So similarly, the Phase 4 grant covers the 10-county area, but has a large focus in Ashtabula and Trumbull counties, with some large acquisitions in Portage County as well. The largest tract to be purchased will be the Portage Meadows, which is tract 1, features 100 acres of lakes and ponds, 110 acres of wetlands, and 335 acres of mature forest, young forest, meadow, and scrub shrub upland area. So this property is less than 1,500 feet from the Cuyahoga River and immediately upstream from the primary source of Akron's drinking water supply, Lake Rockwell Reservoir. The Portage Park District is acquiring this property with assistance from Western Reserve and will then own and operate it as a public park. So this proposal had 6 10+ matching partners, included 4 partner categories, including continued protection work with Western Reserve Land Conservancy and the Cleveland Museum of Natural History through NAWCA. It adds West Creek Conservancy as a new NAWCA partner and has a public access on 2,416 of the 2,783 conserved acres, meaning about 84% of these acres are not only conserved for habitat and environmental services, but also for public enjoyment. So for the Phase 4 grant, we're again working in partnership with committed partners, some of which you may recognize from the previous list, including Ashtabula County Metro Parks, the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, National Wild Turkey Federation, Natural Areas Land Conservancy, Ohio Division of Wildlife, Portage Park District, the Nature Conservancy, Trumbull County Metro Parks, West Creek Conservancy, and Western Reserve Land Conservancy. So it's truly the partnership that makes these NAWCA conservation efforts possible. Without the match provided through these partners, often through either Ohio Public Works Commission Clean Ohio grants, Ohio EPA Water Resource Restoration Sponsorship Program grants, or H2 Ohio grants, and the willingness to join as a collective group to figure out which match can be used and where grant funds should be directed, these NAWCA grants would not be possible. So huge thank you to them for their willingness to come to the table. DU helps to coordinate this process and administers the grant after submitting the proposal, but it is then these partners in the end that manage the properties in the long term. So to wrap up on NACA, I just wanted to point out a few tracks from the upcoming Phase 4 grant. On the left is Spring Creek Preserve. It's a match tract acquired by West Creek Conservancy and offered as match in this proposal. It protects 356 acres, including 336 acres of Category 3 wetlands. WCC will utilize the property to engage urban youth in outdoor education activities, including hunting, fishing, and trapping, in addition to natural resource education. Top right is the LEAP BioBlitz at Portage Meadows, mentioned a couple of slides ago. This property will be purchased using combined match and grant funds. The Lake Allegheny Partnership for Biodiversity, or LEAP region, held its BioBlitz at this property in 2023, where 60 of the region's best field biologists spent a day surveying the property. And finally, a barred owl can be seen in the bottom right at the Mill Creek Preserve property. This is also a grant and new match tract. It's a 221-acre property to be acquired by Ashtabula County Metro Parks and contains 127 acres of Category 3 wetlands. Formal bird surveys have documented 148 species of birds on the property, including the barred owl. So let's now move on to a different region, the Western Lake Erie Basin. So this area is a restoration focus for Ducks Unlimited, and here we also depend on partnerships to help identify, design, fund, implement, and monitor these projects. First, why work in the Western Lake Erie Basin? Well, it's a migration and staging area for high conservation priority species throughout the flyway, and it's the most important migration staging area for American black ducks in the Mississippi flyway. Additionally, it's designated as a regional shorebird reserve by the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network and supports over 300 species of birds, in addition to a wide array of other wildlife, fish, and plants, many of which are state or federally listed. And finally, let's not forget about the fishing opportunity, with the basin offering a world-class perch and walleye fishing. The commercial, tribal, and recreational sport fishing industries create over $7 billion in revenue annually, supports over 75,000 jobs, and Lake Erie has the greatest commercial harvest of all of the Great Lakes. That said, this region has been under immense environmental stress, losing over 90% of its wetlands and 95% of its coastal wetlands, with only about 4% of the historical wetland complex, the Great Black Swamp, remaining. The loss of wetland function has led to impaired water quality, including algal blooms and unsafe drinking water, has negatively affected the fishery, and therefore has had negative economic implications as well. Furthermore, there has been the introduction of aquatic and terrestrial invasive species, which disrupts ecological processes. Lastly, I'll mention habitat fragmentation. With 70% of the area in row crop production and 90% of the watershed private, there's an absolute need to work with private landowners on restoration projects to address the environmental issues. This may be working with farmers to employ cover crops, or working with private landowners who desire to restore some ag fields back to wetlands, or restore or enhance degraded wetlands back into functional wetlands to achieve their mission through restoration programs. This leads me to my next slide, which is one grant program we have used to help fund private lands programs along with our partners in the Western Lake Erie Basin. GLFRA, the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act. DU and its partners submitted the first phase of this proposal, restoring fish and wildlife habitat and improving water quality in the Western Lake Erie Basin back in the early teens, and is now in the Phase 4 iteration of this grant. It's a regional proposal funded through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and this grant covers 3 states with partners including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Ohio Division of Wildlife, Michigan DNR, Indiana DNR, and the Ottawa Soil and Water Conservation District, as well as Pheasants Forever. These funds specifically address restoring wetland and native prairie habitat on private lands in the Western Lake Erie Basin, with the third objective of improving water quality in Lake Erie by restoring habitats that have proven to reduce the amount of sediment and nutrients reaching the lake. In Ohio, we work closely with Partners of Fish and Wildlife, Ohio Division of Wildlife, Ottawa Soil and Water Conservation District, and the landowners to identify, design, and implement these private lands projects. So DU and its partners have successfully closed 3 regional proposals since 2014, totaling about $1.4 million, restoring over 1,200 wetland acres and 423 grassland acres project area wide, surpassing set objectives by 149%. Just in Ohio, we've restored about 838 wetland acres through these 3 phases, accounting for about 69% of the total restored wetland acres. The Phase 4 proposal was awarded in 2022, amended in 2023, and along with our partners, we are well on our way to surpassing the project goals. A large amount of the Ohio restoration through GLIFRA has been pursued in Ottawa County. Often these GLIFRA funds allow us and partners to provide cost share to other projects funded by CREP or H2 Ohio, and may aid in providing a pump, basin, or water control structure for water management and reconnection to the nearby river or creek to improve overall hydrology and connectivity. Many of these projects in Ottawa County are designed by our partner, Ottawa Soil and Water. So here are a few of the completed projects from the current GLIFRA 4 proposal. The project in the upper left restored 2 wetland units totaling 20.5 acres of emergent wetlands by constructing levees and installing water control structures. The 51.5 acre tract of upland native grasses and forbsing here were also restored as part of that project, in addition to a 5.5 acre tract of riparian forest. The wetlands and uplands at this project improve water quality for the Little Portage River while providing ample habitat for birds and other wildlife. The 15.5 acre restoration on the right is also a H2 Ohio project that required some additional funding supplied through GLIFRA. The GLIFRA funding allowed the installation of the electric pump and basin, which connects the wetland to the Portage River and allows for water management. So speaking of H2 Ohio, that is another funding source which we have been able to utilize to address habitat and water quality issues in collaboration with our partners. Specifically, H2 Ohio has been around for about 5 years, launched by Governor DeWine in 2019, and has already been a game changer for the health of Lake Erie and other water bodies in Ohio, for wetland conservation, and for the sportsmen and sportswomen that enjoy them. So it's a comprehensive plan to improve statewide water quality with a focus in the Western Lake Erie Basin. ODNR is charged with administering a nice slice of the H2 Ohio pie, which they invest primarily on wetland projects that will filter ag runoff. Thus far, DU has received 9 H2 Ohio grants from the Ohio DNR, and we're using that money to conserve more than 1,800 acres of wetlands, along with our partners that will filter thousands of acres of agricultural runoff to remove sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen from the water, so that before they can reach Lake Erie or another larger water body. So with that, let's go on a brief tour of some of the H2 Ohio projects that DU is working on with our partners. Our Little Portage Wildlife Area H2 Ohio project is the most expensive and the most complicated that we've worked with. Here, DU engineers designed upgrades to the wetland management system of levees, pumps, water control structures, and water distribution channels to improve 254 acres of coastal wetlands at the confluence of the Portage and Little Portage rivers in Ottawa County. We also work with 2 adjacent farmers to divert more than 400 acres of ag drainage to a new pump station that will send the nutrient-rich water into wetlands instead of into the Little Portage as it did previously. The project is at the 99% completion stage and should be wrapped up in the next couple of weeks. We've worked very closely with the Division of Wildlife on this one during all phases of the project. Gatorland LLC was actually our first completed H2 Ohio project. DU worked with Fish and Wildlife Service, Partners for Fish and Wildlife, the Division of Wildlife, and Ottawa Soil and Water, and the landowner to restore a 23-acre wetland in an ag field on private land in Ottawa County adjacent to Packer Creek. We installed a pump and diverted 62 acres of ag tile and surface drainage to the pump, which sends that water into the wetland instead of flowing into the creek as it did previously. This wetland was restored in 2021, and as you can see here, after a couple of growing seasons, it is looking pretty good. Last summer, we observed a pair of state-threatened trumpeter swans with a brood of little ones using the wetland, which was pretty exciting to see. Rust wetlands. This is another H2 Ohio project on private land, and this time DU, Division of Wildlife, Partners for Fish and Wildlife, and Ottawa Soil and Water restored 4 wetlands totaling 25 acres adjacent to St. River in Ottawa County. 238 acres of ag runoff are diverted to 2 pump stations that then send the water into the wetlands instead of flowing into the river as it did pre-project. So this project was completed in the fall of 2023, and we're expecting a nice response of wetland vegetation in 2024 and are looking forward to the establishment of some high quality emergent marshes. The Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge Navarre Marsh Unit. So this H2 Ohio project is at the mouth of the Toussaint River. This unit of the refuge is actually owned by Energy Harbor as part of the David Bessie nuclear facility, but managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service as part of the refuge. We're partnering closely with the refuge to implement the project. Here, DU engineers designed 2 new pump stations that will draw nutrient-rich water from Lake Erie to help with the management of 628 acres of Lake Erie coastal wetlands. As the water flows through these marshes, nitrogen and phosphorus will be removed before outletting back into the lake. This project is also at the 99% completion stage, and we expect it will be fully completed in the coming weeks. So this project is actually outside of the Western Lake Erie Basin down in Delaware County at Delaware Wildlife Area. However, I wanted to share it with you because this is a really cool H2 Ohio project that we completed recently working with Division of Wildlife. DU designed the restoration of a 41-acre wetland in an ag field, and then new levees, water control structures, and water distribution channels enhanced 3 other wetlands totaling 175 acres. The 4 wetlands were hydrologically connected to form somewhat of a treatment train. The idea is to improve water quality in Delaware Lake by pumping water from the lake into the first wetland in the train and allowing that water to move through the interconnected system of wetlands to maximize the amount of nutrients that are removed from the water before it is returned to the lake. The other idea here was to address a lack of quality wetland habitat at this wildlife area for waterfowl and waterfowl hunting. So with that, this wraps up our tour of H2 Ohio projects. We're mostly in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So finally, I'd like to address the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Most recently, GLRI funding provided through cooperative agreements with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA have allowed us to work with them and other partners on some unique opportunities, both protecting land through facilitative acquisitions and through restoring wetlands. Very briefly, I'd like to point out that this has been a great partnership for DU, which has provided funds for us to work on conservation projects throughout the Great Lakes region with a total investment of about $58.3 million, conserving 44,449 acres on 109 different projects throughout the Great Lakes since the establishment of the GLRI in 2010. We have worked with more than 85 unique partners on GLRI projects throughout the Great Lakes states. So one GLRI project that we just recently completed last year with the Howard Marsh Metro Park in Lucas County. This was funded through the GLRI, funding via NOAA with additional funds provided by Ohio Division of Wildlife and Metro Parks of the Toledo area. The property was already owned by Toledo Metro Parks, but due to cost of restoration, the project was not implemented for many years. This area was historically marsh, which had been drained and converted to ag land. And this project restored nearly 1,000 acres back to coastal marsh or associated upland buffer, with phase 1 completed in 2018 and phase 2 seeing final completion last year. So phase 2 can be seen here in the photo. It includes 199 acres restored back to wetlands and hydrologically reconnected to Lake Erie, which also provides fish passage to the marsh. This is a DU engineered project, which is a service that DU provides. We have a full engineering shop here at our regional office. So this was a recently completed project. Let's take a quick look at an upcoming GLRI project. The Camp Sobrowski is an approximate 64-acre property acquired by DU using GLRI funds, which we are currently in the process of transferring to Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. The aerial photo here was taken last fall and is pre-restoration. So this is a partnership project between the refuge, the Friends of Camp Sobrowski, and DU. DU has completed a topographic survey of the 25-acre coastal marsh and just last week sat down with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA to begin the engineering concept design. The restoration will remove most of the interior levees, which are degraded, and will hydrologically reconnect the wetland to the creek. GLRI restoration funds are provided through a NOAA cooperative agreement, which will address objectives in Focus Area 1 of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative Action Plan 3, specifically as a US EPA approved management action required to delist beneficial use impairments in the Maumee area of concern. Post-restoration, the site will be open to the public as part of the refuge. So through all these partnerships and funding sources, there's a commitment to long-term conservation. For example, all GLIFR projects require a signed 10-year agreement by the landowner with PFW, and DU and our partners have observed that these projects are typically maintained by landowners for much longer. All NUCRA acquisitions are protected in perpetuity and require a recorded notice of grant requirements, along with a DU subaward agreement of 25 years for grant-funded projects. And H2 Ohio agreements under $250,000 require a 30-year agreement to maintain the restored property for that minimum period of time. So finally, I'd also like to mention again that another service DU can provide for our partners are facilitative acquisitions. This does mainly apply to our state and federal partners, as the benefit of a facilitative acquisition is that DU can act quickly to acquire a property, while the cogs of bureaucracy can make this a slow process for the state and federal government agencies, sometimes sabotaging a deal. We were able to help Ohio Division of Natural Resources expand the Moxley Wildlife Area by 110 acres in 2023 through a facilitative acquisition. And again, Camp Sobrowski is currently being transferred to the Fish and Wildlife Service after DU purchased the property last fall. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize our partners for the Ohio Partnership Hunt. So this is an annual event between DU, the Division of Wildlife, and the Lake Erie Marsh Association, and it is made possible by the donation of resources and time of the many hunt clubs in the region near Sandusky Bay. Partnership with the clubs has allowed DU the opportunity to offer this experience to donors, to raise funds for conservation, and to continue building partnerships and relationships. Hunt club members are dedicated and great partners, and we're often able to identify projects on those properties as well, allowing for more private land restoration. During last year's 21st annual hunt, DNR Director Mertz and DU's Chief Conservation Officer from our national headquarters in Memphis, Karen Waldrop, were able to share time in the blind, as seen in the photo on the lower left. So developing these personal relationships helps to establish a strong partnership. But what's to come in 2024? Well, continued conservation through partnership. H2 Ohio will continue to be a big part of our work in Ohio. The Little Portage and Navarre projects I already discussed will be completed, as will phase 1 of our H2O project at Mallard Club Wildlife Area in Lucas County. We also have 3 ongoing private land H2 Ohio projects that will be done this calendar year. We'll continue to work on implementation of private lands projects with PFW, Division of Wildlife, Ottawa Soil and Water Conservation District, and private landowners to deliver GLIFR restoration projects on private lands. We'll begin 2 new NAWCA grants, the Western Lake Erie Coastal Project in the Western Lake Erie Basin, and Lake Erie Coastal Wetlands Phase 4, which together will conserve more than 6,600 acres in the Lake Erie watershed. Due to the increase in CAP, this was a competitive funding cycle, yet both $3 million Ohio NAWCA proposals are expected to be funded. We wrote a small NAWCA proposal to help fund and restore the Champion Wetland Connector in Trumbull County in partnership with Trumbull County Metro Parks and Western Reserve Land Conservancy. Now, this 117-acre parcel of land includes 35 acres of emergent marsh, forested and scrub shrub wetlands, 19 acres of upland deciduous forest, in addition to 63 acres of agricultural field, which will be restored to pollinator habitat in partnership with PFW. So the small NAWCA grant will partially fund this acquisition. We are also in the early stages of buying a 50-acre property that will be transferred to Fish and Wildlife Service to expand the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, and a 61-acre property for Division of Wildlife that will expand the Tiffin Wildlife Area in Fulton County. New DU engineering projects are starting up at the Camp Sobrowski and Menier units of Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, and we expect to submit a proposal in partnership with West Creek Conservancy for the engineering and restoration of at least 10 wetlands on the Spring Creek Preserve, a match track discussed earlier in the Phase 4 NACA grant. We'll also wrap up a small NACA project at the East Harbor State Park in Ottawa County, which is in partnership with Division of Wildlife and Ohio Division of Parks and Watercraft, that will dramatically improve wetland management capability of the 350-acre Middle Harbor wetland. Note that none of these projects would be possible without the partnerships. Finally, just to bring it home, why do wetland conservation at all? Why build these partnerships to deliver protection, restoration, and enhancement? Well, it's this. It's habitat for birds, other wildlife and fish, water quality, groundwater recharge, flood control, recreation, and stimulating local economies. This is important work that needs to be done, and we have the opportunities to continue to deliver on wetland conservation in a big way through current funding opportunities in Ohio and through great partnerships. We also have the privilege of meeting some wonderful people along the way that are dedicated to this cause. With that, thank you very much for your time. We're always on the lookout for new partners to further the conservation mission. So please feel free to contact me if any of these partnership opportunities struck a chord with you today, and I'll gladly take any questions or comments.
Thank you for that presentation, Corey. I'm sure that that large collection of projects that you listed will certainly make some ears perk up and some people sit up in interest. I was very fascinated with that one map of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative projects showing, well, the projects really coincided with the potential for major landscape level restoration sites throughout the Great Lakes system, like in Saginaw Bay and in Green Bay in Wisconsin, and of course the Western Lake Erie Basin in the western part of our state. With that, to our attendees, you're welcome to type any questions in the chat or in the questions part of the portal. But as our attendees are figuring out what to ask Corey, I got some questions for you.
Sure.
Where to start though? I got a lot of questions. Spent a lot of time writing them down. So in the beginning of the presentation, you discussed a phase 3 round of the NACA, the NACA funded wetland protection projects, and you mentioned that for phase 3 completed by the 1st of April, over 2,000 acres were to be protected. I was wondering, has DU at all gotten approval for these projects yet from NACA, or are those merely the sum of acres that were proposed in your projects to protect?
So the Lake Erie Coastal Wetlands Phase 3 is a grant we were awarded in 2021. And so the 3-year term of the grant ends on April 1st. So that total acreage are acres that have been protected over the course of the last 3 years since submitting that proposal. So now all these properties are, most of these again were protection projects. So acquisitions with a couple of conservation easements in there. So all of these projects have been completed. They're now owned by our partners, operated by our partners within the proposal. And you know, something I don't really get into in the presentation is that these are somewhat of a, these proposals, these NACA proposals are somewhat of a bear to administer. There's just a lot of documentation and a lot of requirements by NACA and the Division of Bird and Habitat Conservation Department. So each one of these acquisitions requires documentation of probably 10 different pieces of information that you need to get to them, which include I guess you'd call them yellow book appraisals, and then these appraisals need to be reviewed by an independent appraiser, and that verifies the purchase price, and then that's what can be used as match, or what can be the cost of the acquisition for for the grant funds for particular tracks. But I guess to shortly answer your question, yeah, this is the end of coming to the end period of this grant period, and these are tracks that have been procured and documented and approved by NACA.
I see. Well, that's great to hear that DU has helped conserve another 2,000 acres in this part of our state. I certainly like to visit the conserved and restored wetlands we have in the Chagrin River Watershed. I believe our headwaters is a certain glacial lake. I forget the name though, but that is conserved and managed by Portage County Metro Parks. So
Okay, yeah.
yeah,
And there's a lot of these sites, to be honest, that
mhm.
I still need to get to someday as well. So you know, our partners are, as I said, will end up being the long-term managers of these, and we
Yes.
can assist with you know, technical assistance with wetland management and that type of thing. And
Mhm.
as I mentioned, for an upcoming one of the upcoming phase 4 grants, we're going to work with West Creek Conservancy to put out a proposal at one of their sites to do some potential engineering work with using our DU engineering staff here. So yeah, all pretty exciting stuff.
Related to like successive like projects at these restoration and protection sites. I was wondering to what extent is Ducks Unlimited involved in project sites after they're restored and after they are acquired. Do you offer like any long-term management services, stuff like that? Like to what extent is your organization involved in that sort of stuff?
Yeah, it sort of depends regionally.
Yeah.
Again, for a lot of these Northeast protection projects and for a lot of these NACA grants, we're involved in you know, assisting with acquiring the lands. But as far as long-term management, that's basically up to either the conservancy or the park that is taking on ownership and management. If there are ever any questions with wetland management, we can assist there. But I would say more in the Western Lake Erie Basin and typically more along with our restoration projects. That's an area where we provide, you know, kind of a more hands-on management service, either working with the infrastructure that we have helped to design or put in. Our engineers are always available to answer questions and assist with that. Or, you know, we often work with private landowners on their private lands projects to make suggestions about water management, you know, what to do during a certain time of year, you know, when you might do a prescribed burn or that sort of thing. So, so I'd say we're more closely involved with the hands-on management and helping with that guidance on the restoration projects, opposed to some of these knock-up protection projects that we help facilitate.
I see. I see what you mean. Yeah, I would expect the engineering firm or whoever designed the structures for these restoration projects to continue being involved with the project. And since Ducks Unlimited does have experience with wetland management, has been doing it for so long, I suppose that's no surprise that you are continuously involved in these projects in the Western Lake Erie Basin. I was wondering, in particular, about these coastal restoration projects. How important is it typically for DU to restore the original hydrology of the wetland site?
I think that's a a huge component of our work, and especially these days with H2 Ohio, there's the I guess environmental services are people are becoming more aware of that and the importance of water quality and the importance of wetland function. So historically the Great Black Swamp and the Western Lake Erie Basin and those coastal marshes did a lot to naturally filter the water.
Mhm.
And flood control and before sort of a lot of it became industry along the coast, and a lot of hard surfaces. There were more natural soft surfaces that could absorb shocks and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think restoring that natural hydrology, and then also these large projects that you mentioned, the GLRI projects, they help address some of the issues with fish habitat and having areas to spawn. They allow fish passage for fish, which can come in and then utilize the marsh, which right now for Camp Zabrowski, for example, is completely disconnected from the creek, so that's unavailable to any fish going up and down the river. So yeah, to your point, I think it's a huge issue that people are becoming more aware of because of some of the grant programs that are in place currently that really highlight some of those services that wetlands and their buffers can provide.
I see. Yeah. Within the restoration field, it seems that there's increasing focus on retaining and restoring habitat connectability and trying to minimize fragmentation where and when that can be achieved. And I'm glad that the realization does extend to wetlands and to the pathways that water itself can act as a connector between habitats, as you mentioned with fish and places where they can spawn and then swim out to the lake or go to nearby rivers. So yeah, that's it's great to hear that it's becoming a more recognized and important feature of these restoration projects. And
Yeah, and I'll mention also, I think it's a great thing that private landowners are utilizing these programs more and more frequently. And in the beginning, it may have seemed just like 10 acres here, 15 acres here wasn't a really big deal, but in areas kind of like Ottawa County, these are really adding up and starting to provide pretty massive corridors for restoration, and you can start to see it on a map, so it's pretty neat.
that is neat. That's cool. I have like in regards to the Great Black Swamp and the sheer number of wetlands that used to dominate the Western Lake Erie coastline. I was wondering, so you mentioned that a lot of this funding is going towards coastal wetlands. Yet when we looked at the map, like some of the maps that you showed, a lot of these projects that were labeled coastal wetlands are actually like not actually on the coast, but technically within the Lake Erie watershed. So I was wondering, in the Western Lake Erie Basin, um, like how many projects or what percentage of the projects you're working on are actually like right on the coast of Lake Erie?
I would say that it's hard to give a percentage without looking at some of the sites, but I would say that almost all of them that we're working on are within probably 7 or 8 river miles of the lake. So they're not right on the coast, but they're pretty darn close to the outlets there, to the river mouths, and so in those cases, I think we're kind of considering those coastal projects. But some of the big ones we're working on, for example, Navarre, that the Fish and Wildlife Service operates, that's a 628 acre emergent marsh that is right on the coast. The Howard Marsh project that we saw earlier, that's essentially right on the coast. It's just upstream.
Yeah.
Camp Zabrowski is, I think, about 5 miles from the river mouth. So these are all projects that are pretty near the main body of water, Lake Erie.
Sure. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I've looked at hydrology maps of Lake Erie and the Black River. The Maumee River Basin that stretches into northwest Ohio and into Indiana, and I see all these coastal tributaries that empty into the lake east of Sandusky Bay, and I'm not really familiar with what the coastline looks over there, so that's why I was wondering if any sort of restoration projects were occurring right on the coast. Um, but yeah, anyways, Corey, we do have a question from one of our attendees. Dennis asks, what do you think has been some of the biggest challenges with these projects in the Western Lake Erie Basin?
Um, let's see. Some of the biggest challenges, I mean, for a lot of the large ones, it's just cost initially, because the landscape is so dramatically changed from what it once was. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of engineering to initiate and to actually to construct these large projects. So luckily, I mean, there are those funding sources available now, but the Howard Marsh project, for example, I think Toledo Metro Parks owned that for something like 15 years prior to restoration because because they just could not get it funded. There was not enough money, so it just remained ag land until they could finally, develop partnerships with Division of Wildlife and DU and be able to find the funding to get that project done. And a lot of that's possible because of the Maumee area of concern as well. And there's a whole process of delisting DUIs, beneficial use impairments. So once that's recognized, it can help a project get funded. But I think, yeah, for these larger projects, funding is a huge issue. And then, for the smaller projects, I mean, we've lately have a good network, especially in Ottawa County, of branching out and meeting landowners who are interested. That's been a great place to do work, but I will say beyond, the Western Lake Erie Basin obviously expands further beyond, so it has been a challenge to find good sites and interested folks. Sometimes, as you get kind of further from the coast, you're still in the basin, but you're further from the coast, and some of these outer counties, it's just even a lot more ag and just more challenging to find good sort of wetland opportunities for restoration.
Sure. You alluded to a decreasing interest in participating in these programs as you get further away from the coast. Is that an overall trend that DU has noticed in the Western Lake Erie Basin?
I don't know if I'm not sure if it's decreasing landowner interest or just sort of decreasing opportunity because of the nature of the landscapes as you get further away from the coast.
Yeah.
There's still, there's still areas that can be restored, but just the nature of the substrate in an area like Ottawa County, it's essentially clay and holds water really well. And as you get to some other counties that are further out, for example, I've in Fulton County recently and looking at some sites, and it just it's not necessarily as conducive to wetland restoration. So you have to look a little harder and yeah, just be willing to I guess put the time in to try to find sites that are that would take restoration well. But
Sure.
but yeah, I think that's the challenge. Not necessarily a decrease in landowner interest, but just a decrease in sites that would make for good restoration sites.
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. Yeah, I was really struck by the graphic which showed the increase in investments that Ducks Unlimited is making in Ohio. That was a huge increasement in the past 14 years, from about $500,000 to around 7 million. Does Ducks Unlimited project that trend and increase in funding, or the general like annual number like around 7 million? Is this trend of increasing funding going to continue? Like, where do you see Ducks Unlimited taking their investments in the next couple of years in Ohio?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, both Russ, Terry, and I, we do a lot of proposal writing, and we'll continue to seek funds and good projects to implement in the state. You know, a lot of this opportunity has been available because of the funding sources. So, GLRI in 2010 sort of sparked things starting to go up. GLIFRA back in 2014 allowed us to identify some good funding sources for private lands projects. And then, I mean, H2 Ohio has been a game changer. So we've been able to utilize $8.8 million for restoration projects, utilizing H2 Ohio funds. And then the other great thing about those is they can be utilized, since they're a state, state source of funding, they can be utilized in federal match programs as well. So, so that's really been a game changer as well. So yeah, I mean, we definitely will keep doing our best to do as much conservation as we can in Ohio. And I'll mention, I don't work much on the sort of the fundraising side. We have, the whole development team that does that, but it was also a record year in development in Ohio. I think they raised, I'm pretty sure it was like around $1.9 million, I want to say. Could be off on that, but just shy of 2 million, which was a record for them. So that's from fundraising events in Ohio. And then yeah, we are able to use those funds to leverage for more public funding. So we will continue to do as much as work as possible in Ohio, and it will just, whether we plateau eventually, it's hard to say if we'll just keep rising and rising every year, but we'll certainly reach for a high water mark every year, and we'll continue to write proposals and try to bring money in for these conservation projects.
Sure, yeah. So basically, in other words, you guys would just keep doing the work if the funding's there. Yeah, that seems to be the case for a lot of wetland restoration and just environmental work projects to begin with. I know, like us at Chagrin River Watershed Partners, like most of our work is funded by grants and membership dues and donations. So yeah, that makes sense. So to change the subject for a minute and to discuss like the partnerships that Ducks Unlimited has been engaging with over like the past several years in the Western Lake Erie Basin. I was wondering, do these hunting clubs, which hunt at these restoration sites in Western Lake Erie, do they participate at all in the citizen science, information gathering, anything at all about how these restoration projects are going after the ribbons are cut and the bulldozers go away?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, so the hunt clubs are, private lands that members pay dues at, and then, we will occasionally, if we've identified good projects that they would like to implement there in natural marshes, we'll work with them to do those. Also say that, so one club, Winus Point, actually has Winus Point Marsh Conservancy, which is its own entity, its own nonprofit. And they do a lot of science there. They're part of some large mallard studies right now, and host folks from several different universities to do projects throughout the year, and have their own amount of staff that work at the site, and they promote their natural marshes there, and in addition to that, we're actually, as part of the next NACA program, there's in Western Lake Erie Basin, so the upcoming grant in July, there's some money there to do some restorations on a couple of their units as well. So yeah, I would say, they're certainly engaged in science and community science, and we work closely with folks at the clubs as well and stay in contact, and it's kind of like these other small private lands projects. I mean, there usually aren't big ribbon cuttings or anything like that. These are usually pretty small projects that we may advertise to some degree or market, but on the whole, it's pretty quiet. But as we continue to do restorations at some of their areas, plus restorations on other private lands of individuals, again, it just continues to build that network of quality habitat for ducks and other wildlife.
Yeah, sure. It's really cool that Ducks Unlimited is able to engage with stakeholders as hunters, since they probably have a much more intimate um, understanding of population numbers, where and when they're breeding. Like they're in many ways great eyes on the ground for what's actually happening with the conservation status of waterfowl and other species in these restoration sites. So that's really cool that you guys continue to engage with them. Um, we did have
Yeah, and I'll
another
say,
question. Oh, I'm
go ahead.
sorry, Corey, what was that?
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, and there in terms of, I mentioned we have the Ohio Partnership Hunt, and it's their resources, their time, their land that allows us to, offer these opportunities as a donor event once a year, and so that's huge, and like you say, they have an appreciation for the land, and you're able to build partnerships with other, division staff and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's great.
That's cool. So like when Ducks Unlimited and its partners go about to sites that possibly can be the site of a restoration project or a conservation easement or something like that, um, what incentives can be given to like farmers in particular to sign conservation easements or actually sell their land to park districts, nature preserves, stuff like that? Like aside from like cold hard cash, like are there any other incentives that can be given to farmers to uh, give up some of the land to restore wetlands?
Yeah, I would say, obviously the CREP programs, the NRCS CREP programs are pretty large, and they pay incentives to turn parts of fields, ag land back into wetlands. And besides, I think money talks. It's often sort of those dollar incentives that really persuade folks one way or the other.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I have a good answer for that.
Nice.
Yeah, if people are really, I do know we have worked on some projects that have previously been fields where, people are uh, not so much worried about the funds, but they really are just conservationists, and they want to see their land go back to sign, sort of that natural, um, reset it into that natural setting. And I think that can be an incentive if that's what that individual wants and is focused on.
Yeah.
And a lot of times with H2 Ohio and CREP and these GLIFR funds I discussed, typically, or in many cases, that restoration can be fully covered by these different programs, and be
Yep.
almost completely paid for by these programs, so that there's not a huge cost to the landowner. So yeah, I think that can be pretty special if somebody wants their own private marsh. Um, there is an opportunity for that.
Yeah. Ohio isn't really known as a centerpiece for wealth, so money definitely does talk. I would expect. Though, like, just to give more focus on the whole money part and like the conservation easements and stuff. Are there any like funding mechanisms to pay farmers or landowners in general to keep restored land, like restored to protect it? And does that ever like expire, like the agreement for landowners to keep the land restored? Or can they just do what they want with it after like 10 years or something?
Yeah, usually I think most CREP agreements are 15 years, I'm pretty
Okay.
sure. So most of these agreements are not in perpetuity.
Mhm.
The only one I can think of, so the H2 Ohio agreements, I mentioned, um, if a restoration is $250,000 or under, it's a 30-year agreement. I'm fairly certain that if it's over $250,000, it does become in perpetuity.
Okay.
So that would be a long-term agreement. So there are some cases for it there.
Yeah.
But in general, for these restorations that, some may be longer than others, but there are generally expirations. But again, we have noticed with landowners, with these GLIFR funds, it requires the signing of a 10-year partnership of fish and wildlife agreement, and going back to these year after year. And some of these projects are getting pretty old now, and landowners have stayed committed. And once they get it turned back into that marsh, maybe they still work part of the field, but the area that has been restored, they'll keep. What we've noticed is that generally they're kept in that natural state, and that most landowners have been very attentive and work to keep the conservation value.
Yeah, sure. I can't help but draw parallels between restoring wetland habitat and trying to keep the landowners like on the side of conservation, like drawing parallels between that and the situation with indigenous peoples and um, other Brazilians in the Amazon rainforest. There's like within like in the global conservation movement, there's a lot of conversation on how to redirect funds to the people living in and around the Amazon to instead support their livelihoods through conservation and land management as opposed to destructive practices like cutting down like trees, selling for wood and then converting the land into agriculture. So I suppose like with the whole discussion of how do we convince the landowners in the Western Lake Erie Basin to keep the restored projects restored in wild land, it makes me think a lot about just the general discussion of like how the flows of money have real world impacts on wildlife and wild lands. And you can see that right here in Western Lake Erie Basin. So
Yeah,
I
certainly.
didn't really have a point. I was just thinking about that.
Um, yeah, what we are, decisions are often driven by economics, but I
Yeah.
think that's why a lot of these programs exist. Um, and I'm not an expert on. I know there are like CREP renewals and that sort of thing. I'm not really. I'd have to check into some of those regulations, because I think there are, after 15 years, I think you can re-up again.
Sure.
Um, So yeah, so that's kind of the neat thing with some of these programs where we're
Mhm.
directing ag runoff. Farmers live in a drainage and they still continue to plant part of their field. At least if they have a restored wetland that we've done often through the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act, there may be new tiling that directs all this drainage to a wetland that's newly restored, that can then sort of purify the water and take out the phosphorus and reduce the nutrients and the sediment before pumping it back out into the creek and then into Lake Erie. So yeah, that's kind of the environmental services that some of these new programs provide are pretty huge.
Yeah, sure. And it's just all about communicating to the landowners, hey, like these benefits, they aren't just about what ends up in your pocketbook with these easements and the sale of the land. These projects, they affect your neighbors. They affect people 50, 60 miles away that you'll never even meet. And on the top of that, they support these migratory birds that fly thousands of miles through this flyway, and all these other co-benefits that like that part in particular, that like trying to explain the co-benefits and trying to like adequately discuss and address the real impact, and it's all about context. So yeah, I mean, I don't see myself personally like actually like I don't know, like pursuing a career, I guess, and trying to convince landowners to do this, but like that's clearly very important for this sort of work. And I think it really just highlights the critical importance of like having partnerships with these people, having partnerships with like hunt clubs and regional land conservancies, like people on the ground who can do the work and know how to like I guess frame conservation and restoration in everyone's best interest.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think a huge part of it is kind of word of mouth
Yeah,
and become ingrained in an area where folks can learn about the benefits and learn that there also are, a project can be, if not completely covered by external funds, can, mostly be covered by grants and that sort of thing. And that, in lots of cases, if a farmer, for example, continues to farm a field and then just restores a small portion into a CREP wetland, they'll likely make more that way than they would have trying to harvest off of a kind of a flooded, wet soil area. So there are, yeah, benefits. It's
that's true.
kind of a win-win, I guess.
Plus, he gets a bunch of high fives from waterfowl enthusiasts.
That's right.
Yeah. All right, Corey. We got no other questions left in the chat. I'm pretty much asked all the questions I wrote down. So, are you ready to wrap up?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks again. It's been a great opportunity and
Yeah.
appreciate the chance to chat with you.
Yeah, it was really nice talking to you too. And I'm gonna look at the video recording again just to see all the other projects I didn't write down that are in my area that well, I might check out, or well, anyone else who attended today's webinar. So thank you again, Corey, for giving the presentation and chatting, and had a good time.
Yeah, me too. And thanks for anybody who tuned in.
Yeah. Yeah, to the attendees who stuck around, thank you guys for coming out and for coming to the webinar series. And yeah, you'll be hearing from us soon.
All
All right.
right, take care.
I'll see you later, Corey. Have a good one, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.